Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sotah Daf Tepav. Today's daf is sponsored by Yechiel Berkowitz in loving memory of Sarah F. Berkowitz on her Yurt site. She was a Holocaust survivor, a fighter, and a lover of Torah. We're now going to get started with the bottom of our daf, the previous daf. I'll just remind you what we were up to. We started the second chapter dealing with the mincha that the Sotah, the meal offering that the Sotah offers, that your husband brings for her. Then we stopped right after we got to a few of the differences. The Mishna highlighted differences between the mincha, the Sotah, and other menachot, other meal offerings. And then one of the contradiction was brought from a Braita, which described the regular mincha process. And from there, we got into dealing with what's the regular process for a regular mincha offering. And we're going through all the details. So we learned, okay, let's just review a little bit of that Braita. The person would bring it in these gold and silver vessels. That was what caused the whole problem in the first place. Then they would put them in a sanctified vessel in the temple, and it would be sanctified. Then you would put the oil and the frankincense on it, bring it to the Kohen. The Kohen would bring it to the altar and put it on the altar in the vessel. Remember, that was the whole thing. It said vidayo, bring it to the southwestern corner of the altar, and that was all it needed to do, meaning it didn't need to take it out of the vessel and put it directly on the altar. Then we said he would put the levona on the side, the frankincense to the side, so that he could do the kmitza, which was the main part that you're now going to take a little portion of it, which we compared to the shechita of a sacrifice, to the slaughtering of the animal. And then take that little piece, put it in another vessel, sanctify it in that vessel, and then put the levona back on top of it. And that was the last thing we ended with the proof from the verse about that bed, kol levona asher ala mincha, that goes on the mincha, so that goes together with it. And then let's continue now, starting with the very last word of your Dalet Amud Bet, uma'alehu umaktiro b'kli sharet. And then you put it on and burn it in the kli sharet, in its vessel, which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? B'kli sharet maktirle, what, you're going to burn it in, you're going to put it on the fire inside that vessel? It doesn't make any sense. Ela ma'alehu b'kli sharet lehaktiro. You bring it up there where the fire is in the kli sharet, in order to burn it. But then obviously you take it out to be burned. But first you do mocho, you salt it. That was also a quote from this Braita. And then you salt it and then put it on the fire. Why do you salt it? Okay, one of the verses, this was in chapter 2 of Vayikra, talking about the mincha offerings. It says you put salt on the mincha offerings. Then, kareva kometz, once you burn the kmitza part, the part that you separated out, the kometz, shiareha ne'achalim, the leftovers, the remainder, gets eaten by the Kohen. Remember, you had the first bowl, which had the dough in it, or the mincha, which you didn't burn on the altar, right? You only took the kmitza from it. Whatever you were left with, the Kohen eats. Minal, and how do we know the Kohen gets to eat this? Dichtiv, v'yiktira Kohen et azkarata. This is a pasuk again from chapter 2. He brings the azkarata, which is a word for the mincha, hamizbecha, and then it says uchtiv. In the next pasuk, vanoteret min mincha la'aron ulevanav kodesh kodeshim Hashem, and whatever's left goes to Aaron and his sons. Karava kometz, and then once you sacrifice, so once you burn the kometz, the markedile. Well, the question is, at what stage of burning the kometz? So there's a machloket to itmar. Hakometz me'matay matir shirayim b'achila. From what point of it burning does it do it? Does it permit the shirayim to be eaten? Rabbi Chanina amar mitashetishlot bo haor, when the fire gets to it. Rabbi Yochanan amar mishetzitata or berubo, has to be on most of the mincha offering before you can actually eat it. B'rishayin kohanim liten letocho yayin udvash, yayin b'shemen udvash. If the kohanim want, this is again a quote from the Braita, they can add wine, oil, or honey to whatever's left of the mincha, and they can cook it up and eat it. To which the Gemara says, my time, how do you know that you can do that? Amarcha, the pasuk says limoshcha. Limoshcha means, it says, this is a pasuk in Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 8, that God tells Aharon, all the gifts that I've given you are, right, the truma and all that, lecha netativ limoshcha, they're for you, limoshcha. So the word moshcha is like mishicha, of anointing. It's a word used with kings. So they're told ligdula, means for greatness. Kederach shem alachim ochlim, you can eat it the way the kings eat it. Okay, so this was given to the kings to eat, meaning it was given to the kohanim to eat like kings. Kings add all sorts of extra food, extra things to their food. Likewise here. By the way, this is mentioned, another Pesach connection. This is mentioned, if I remember correctly, quote me, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that this is one of the reasons given why we eat the Korban Pesach with matzah and maror. We normally think the maror is because it's bitter, but another reason given is because it was l'moshcha. It was supposed to be this beautiful meal, the way kings eat, and kings would eat food with matzah, with maror, with extra, right, vegetables and bread. They didn't just eat meat plain, and it's the way of having a feast like kings. Part of one of the reasons is that's why they ate it like that. So now, and it's also learned out from the word l'moshcha. Ve'en asurin ela milechametz. So now they say the real only issue is make sure not to cook it in a way that the bread leavens, that the dough leavens. How do we know that? It says don't bake the chametz, its portion, because it doesn't make so much sense. What's the chelkam? Their portion, its portion. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, afilu chelkam lo te'afeh chametz. It says even part of it, meaning even the remainder of it, can't be made into chametz. That's the end of, that was taking sentence by sentence of that Braita and showing what were the sources for it. Maybe we had some questions on some of the parts. That was that. Now we're moving back to our Mishnah. So the first line in our Mishnah we've already discussed, which is, she were bringing in the husband of the Sotah, we're bringing in this kfifa mitzrit, this not so nice vessel, and they would bring other menachot, were brought in these gold and silver vessels, and then we brought the Braita to contradict that, because it seems like, right, I'm sorry, my mistake. I just confused it. The Braita said they were bringing in gold and silver vessels. Our Mishnah said she were bringing in a kfifa mitzrit as opposed to everyone else who were bringing in a kli sharet. And then they said, well, they don't bring in a kli sharet, they bring it in the gold and silver vessels, to which we said, oh, in the end, it's ra'oi l'kli sharet, something that could be a kli sharet, whereas a kfifa mitzrit would never be a kli sharet. Then we're now going to go to the next. All mincha offerings have oil and frankincense. This one doesn't need at all. Now we said at the time that there are others that don't have shemen and levona, so we're going to talk about it. The Gemara says, the mincha offering, that the sliding scale offering, that if you sin certain things, you can bring, right, either an animal. If you can't afford it, you bring bird offering. If not, you could bring a meal offering. And in that meal offering, also, that's the mincha for the sinner, the accident, right? It's a sinner who sins unwittingly. It's another example where you don't have shemen and levona. So how could you say all the minchas are shemen and levona except for this one? There's another one. To which the Gemara says, Hachikamar. This is what the Mishnah means. And if you notice, the Mishnah said all of them need shemen and levona, have oil and frankincense mixed in, except for this one. And it also said all of them come from the wheat, and this one comes from barley. So we're going to now explain. What the Mishnah really meant to say was the following: all of them come with shemen, with oil, frankincense, come from wheat, and come from very fine flour. The sinner's offering, even though it doesn't have oil and frankincense, but it does come from this very fine wheat flour, opposed to the minchat sotah, which comes from this not refined flour and from barley. Minchat ha'omer. Now, what about the minchat ha'omer? It also comes from barley, just like the minchat sotah. But number one, tu'una shemen u'levona, it does come with shemen and levona. This was the offering they brought. Again, relevant to right now, on the second day of Pesach, we're in the Korban HaOmer, and with it came a mincha offering. And ba'ageres, and it came from this very fine sifted flour, even though it was barley, but it was finely sifted. Vizo, but the sotah, anatuna lo shemen lo levona, basically has none of these. Uba min ha'seorim, it comes from barley, and ba'akemach, and it's unrefined flour. So we basically have, it's the bottom of the bottom. There are things that have one or the other, but not completely like the sotah. Now we're going to have a Braita that describes the minchat choteh and why it doesn't have shemen and levona. And it's going to eventually connect also with the sotah. It's the same idea, even though they don't bring it up by the sotah. Amar Rabbi Shimon, b'dinu shetei minchat choteh tuna shemen ulevona. Really, logically, you would say it needs the oil and it needs the frankincense. Why? Shelo yeh choteh miskal. what, he's going to be rewarded by the fact that now he doesn't have to pay extra money, right? You're a sinner. You now have to bring a meal offering. And now you get away with, right? Everyone who wants to bring a voluntary meal offering has to end up right there where you could bring it as a voluntary offering if you wanted. So you would have to bring oil and frankincense. You would have to spend more money. Now, the person who sins gets rewarded, that they can get away with a cheap offering. All you need is flour and water, and salt. So I say, so if you don't want to reward the sinner, then why doesn't it need this? We have conflict of interest here. On the one hand, we don't want to let him get away with paying less. On the other hand, we don't want him to have a very fancy sacrifice. He did something bad. It should be a very simple sacrifice. So therefore, we end up siding on not the shemen, not the oil, and not the frankincense. Then they ask, same question we're going to ask about the sin offering. When you bring a korban, let's say I decide I'm going to voluntarily bring an animal offering as an ola or a shlamim. Okay, it's a burnt offering or a peace offering. You have to bring nisachim with it. There's libations that go with it. You bring a mincha with it. You bring a oil libation and a wine libation. So now, you might have thought, if I eat chelev by accident and I have to bring a sin offering for it, I would have to bring nisachim along with it. So that again, he doesn't get rewarded, the sinner, that now the sinner only needs to bring a basic offering without the extras. But why doesn't it need it? Because it really doesn't need nisachim. The answer is the same answer here. We don't want him to have a very nice fancy korban. To which they say, but the chatat of the mitzorah and the asham, the guilt offering, and the sin offering of the mitzorah needs libations. Why is that? Because you don't bring offerings for the leper. The leper who has to bring offerings doesn't bring the chatat and the asham, even though they're called guilt and sin offerings. It's not because of a sin. You might remember this. We had this whole discussion in Nazir about why does the Nazir bring a chatat and why does the Yoledet bring a chatat. Anyway, right now they're talking about the mitzorah and why the mitzorah doesn't bring it. That's because it's not for a sin. To which the Gemara says, really? Ini? Is that true? There's 7 reasons why you get leprosy. And this comes up in a few different Gemaras, and they're all sins. You get leprosy because you did something wrong. So how could you say it doesn't come for a sin? To which they answer, a very interesting answer. What's the atonement process for a leper who sins? Okay, assuming leprosy is a punishment for your sins. So the leprosy itself, the negaim, the things you have in your skin, those are your atonement. They provide you with atonement. He might take korban, but the korban is not coming to atone. The leprosy itself atones for your sins. When you bring the korban, it's that you now, let's start with the beginning. You did something wrong. Your punishment is you now have leprosy. Having the leprosy atones for your sins. But right now you become in a state of impurity that you can't bring sacrifices until you atone, right? You can't have anything sanctified like kochim, eat sacrificial meat, until you bring your sacrifices. The sacrifices are to basically get you out of you want to fully purify yourself. You purify yourself, you go to the mikvah, right? And you do the shaving and all that. But in order to permit you to eat the sacrificial meat, you have to bring the sacrifices of the guilt and the sin offerings. But that's not coming to atone for your sins. The leprosy itself atoned for your sins. So that's 2 different things. Don't get confused. When it comes to a sin offering for a sinner, the sin offering atones for the sin. In leprosy, you might have gotten leprosy because of a sin, and that's all a tradition anyway. It doesn't say so in the Torah, but your sin offering is not coming to atone for that. So then they say, okay, well, and that, by the way, let's just remember, that explains why the mitzorah brings nisachim along with their guilt and sin offerings, because it's not coming to atone for sins. So then they say, okay, well, what about the chatat nazir? Chatat nazir isn't coming to atone for sins. Nazir hasn't done anything wrong. They became a nazir. They finished their nazirut time period. They bring a chatat. Why they bring a chatat, right? It's not for a sin. So if it's not for a sin, you should bring libations with it, right? The meal offering, the wine, and the oil. To which they say, no. Sorry, the Gemara continues to say, Lapisha Eina Ba'al Chet, didn't come because of a sin, to which you might remember, if you learned Nazir and Nadar, and we saw this many, many times, he must hold that the Nazir, okay, this is right, the Nazir, if this whole theory about Rabbi Shimon, who says, really, you should have brought, but lo yeh chotein iskar, but we don't want their korban to be muhudar and all that, and anyone who sins is basically, right, we basically end up saying, you don't bring libations because it makes it nice, it's only when you sin. Well, the Nazir, he must have held the Nazir sinned. And that's why. Why did the Nazir sin? Remember, because you want to learn more, you can go to Nazir Daf Gimel. We talked about it a lot then. The Nazir did something wrong. What did the Nazir do? The Nazir swore off of wine. That's not the way we like to do things. It's not a good thing. Okay? You shouldn't have had to swear off of wine. You should be able to control yourself without having to become a Nazir. So again, we saw different approaches to this. Some people view Nazir as sanctified and a very high thing. But this is the approach of Rabbi Elazar Kapal, that a Nazir is a sinner, and that's why the Nazir doesn't bring the sachim. So we have the one who did the sin offering because they ate chelev or any kind of other unwitting sin doesn't bring the sachim. The Nazir doesn't, but the Mitzorah, whose sacrifice is not coming to atone for the sin, does bring these libations. And that was all to explain anyone who sinned. That was all because of the Sotah. She sinned. That's why she brings the most simple, basic of sacrifices. Rabban Gamliel Omer, Kashem. Now we're going back to the Mishna. Rabban Gamliel had said, just like her actions are animal-like actions, and she doesn't have a particular mate, right? She mates with anyone, she'll cheat on her husband. Also, her sacrifice is ma'achal behema, to which the Gemara brings a brayta. Amar lahem Rabban Gamliel l'chachamim. He said to the chachamim Sofrim, hanichu li v'edrashena kamin chomer. Let me darshan this like a jewel. Okay, I want to add a jewel to this. So the Gemara stops the brayta in the middle for a minute and cuts in and says, Deshame le Rabbi Meir. What led to Rabban Gamliel saying this comment was that he heard what Rabbi Meir said, a different reason why she brings the mincha of the seorim, of the barley. She fed him these fancy foods, and now she's going to have to end up with this mincha, which is animal food, right? It was a measure for measure. So Amar Le, so now going back to, right, so Rabban Gamliel is responding, this is still the Gemara kind of cutting in and saying, what Amar Lahem, he's saying to them, what Rabbi Meir said works very well for a wealthy woman who fed this man she seduced all this nice food. But but a poor woman who didn't serve fancy food to seduce the man, obviously got to him through some other way. Well, right, the same way, so made a way to a man's heart is through his stomach, right? So she must have come up with something else. She didn't have fancy food to feed him. Ela kashem. So then now going back to the Braita, what Rabban Gamliel was coming to respond to that, to say, well, if you ask that question, which he kind of asked, he's now answering it. Ela kashem shemaaseh maaseh be'ema kach korban ma'achal be'ema. He then brought an explanation that fits for both. Okay, even if you're poor and you didn't feed him fancy foods, or if you were wealthy and happened to have not seduced him with food, this would apply to you as well, because your action was classified as a maaseh be'ema, as an animal-like action, and therefore you were punished in that way. That's the end of the Mishnah with the process of the mincha, right? The minchat choteh. Okay, we started with the mincha the minchat sotah, the mincha offering that the Sotah brings, comparing it to the other kinds of minachot, and then explaining why it was barley. That was that last line. Now we have a new Mishnah, continuing in the process. Hayam mevi piyaleh shel cheres. You might remember that we said before that according to some, this actually happened before. So this isn't 100% in order, or at least according to that opinion, that when she did the mincha, she'd already drunk the water. Now we're going to talk about the water. So now it says, the Kohen would bring this, okay, a paili shel cheres. It was a utensil, many different interpretations of what exactly paili is, but of earthenware vessel. Half a log of water from the sink, right? The basin that was in the temple, which, if you remember, was made from the mirrors of the women who seduced the men. So they used their mirrors in Egypt to seduce the men, according to the Midrash, to seduce the men, to get the men to continue having children. The men were giving up hope in Egypt, and they said, why should we have children anymore? And the women used their mirrors, and those mirrors were the ones used for the basin in the temple. Interesting, that was specifically taken from those women because those women sanctify family life. And this Sotah is going against family life, right? She's breaking down the family life and ruining it. And she's basically, right, she ends up having to take from the Shiur where the mirrors were used to basically create this Shiur, where the mirrors were the ones who sanctified the family. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Revi'it. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says it's not half a log, it's a quarter log. Why? Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to see later, disagrees about the amount of text that's supposed to go in. Remember, the text ends up being dissolved into the water. So the amount of text he thinks is smaller, which makes sense, then you would need less water in which to dissolve. Nichnas lahechal. So now the Kohen would go into the hechal, to the sanctuary. Upanali, we know, and immediately turns right. We'll talk about that later. Umakom yasham, and there was a place there that was amal was 1 cubit by 1 cubit. V'tavla shel shayish, there was a marble tile on the floor there. V'tabat hayta kvu'aba, and there was a ring that was in the tile, like kind of welded in, which was used to pick up the tile. In a second, we'll see why. He would pick it up, and then he would take dirt from underneath in the ground there. And he would do this, put enough of this dirt or earth that you would see it in the water. Okay, so you had to put enough in that didn't dissolve right away, but you were actually able to see the earth in the water. Shenemar, how do we know this? Because it says, Umina afar asher yeh bekarka mishkan, from the ground that's in the ground of the Mishkan, right? Take from the earth there. Yikacha Kohen, he should take v'natan elamayim. So the fact that it says v'natan elamayim means you have to see it in the water. We'll see some other drashot of that pasuk today. We're going to see a few different ways. We're going to start today and see more in tomorrow's daf about how to darshan that pasuk. Tan. So now the Gemara starts off with a bright. It seems the rabbis thought it could be any cheres, even an old one, but Rabbi Yishmael says it has to be new. Where does he get this from? We're going to attempt one way, and then we're going to reject it eventually and come up with a different way. My time with Rabbi Yishmael, gamar kli mitzorah. He learns what we call gzera shava. It says kli in one place, it says kli in another place, it says it by mitzorah, and it says it by the leper process, and it says it here. Mala halan cheres chadasha, just like by the mitzorah it had to be new. Afkan cheres chadasha. Likewise here it had to be new. The obvious question is, how did you know it had to be new in the mitzorah process? Well, hata minel and dechtiv v'shachat tzipor ha'achad. You slaughter one of the birds. El kli cheres al mayim chayim. So you slaughter it into this vessel, this earthenware vessel that was filled with fresh water. Mayim chayim usually means water from a stream. Ma mayim chayim shelo ne'asta behem melacha. Mayim chayim means water from a stream that you never used it for anything. Af kli shelo ne'asta behem melacha. So from there they learn, since the mayim chayim went into the kli has to be like the mayim chayim, just like the water was never used. Also, the vessel could never be used before. So now they say, wait a minute. So if you're going to learn that, then we should learn it all the way. If we're going to say, okay, so then we're going to learn kli cheres chadasha, new earthenware vessel, was used by mitzorah. It has to be used by the Sotah as well. Well, then we're going to have another question, because what? Well, if you make gzera shava generally, you learn everything from one to the other. So if you're going to say that, why don't we say it also has to be mayim chayim? And the water in the Shiur wasn't necessarily mayim chayim. It had other waters mixed in. So now we have this problem with assuming that this is Rabbi Yishmael's reasoning. Doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't we take the gzera shava all the way? In other words, the issue is Rabbi Yishmael learned gzera shava to teach. This is what the Gemara is suggesting, to learn that it has to be a new earthenware vessel. In which case, you should say also by the Sotah, it has to be fresh water, like from a stream. To which the Gemara says, yeah, it's true. You're right. Rabbi Yishmael achinami. It is that way according to Rabbi Yishmael. How do we know this? Dama Rabbi Yochanan said, when it comes to mei Shiur, the water of the Shiur, of this basin in the temple, Rabbi Yishmael omer me ma'ayanhin, v'chachamim omrim mishal me'moten. There's a machlokes between specifically Rabbi Yishmael and the rabbis. Does it come from all different waters according to the rabbis, or according to Rabbi Yishmael? It had to come. All the water in the Shiur was from water from stream, and it was fresh water, and then that would work perfectly. However, you might remember that I told you we're going to eventually reject this. Why is that? Because we can knock down this gzera shava to learn from mitzorah to Sotah. Why? Because mana mitzorah sheken ta'un eitz erez ve'ezov u'shni tolat. You have to put this It's Erez, the cedar tree, and the Ezov, the hyssop, and the Shni Tolat, and the scarlet, and the if you do the translation of that. Why did I forget that? Anyway, you have to bring that. I'm going to look right now for a second for the translation of it. Cheers. The Shni, sorry. Okay, my mistake. The Shni Tolat is the scarlet wool. Okay, it goes together. The Shni Tolat, it's the scarlet wool. Okay, so it basically in the Metzora process, you need to use those materials. And in the leper process, but you don't need that in the Sotah process. So if you're going to say Gzera Shava, well, everything should apply, and you should also put into the water, just like you did with the leper. You should put these objects in the water as well. To which the Gemara says, fine, that doesn't work. So Amar Rabba, Amar Ka, we're going to give a whole different reason how we got to a new Kli Cheres. Well, and how we learn it, we do learn it from leper, but not from Gzera Shava, not from the word Kli appearing in both places. But here it says, because once you say Gzera Shava, we're going to have to take it across the board, and we don't. Bikli Cheres, when it says the Kohen takes Mayim Kedoshim, sanctified waters, Bikli Cheres, it could have used different language. Didn't have to say in the Kli Cheres, because it says in the Kli Cheres. Okay, bit usually means in the. Okay, it kind of adds in the in it. It's included in the word bit. It's not just in, but in the. Well, in the Kli Cheres seems to be referring to some klisha. Amarti l'chakval. Must be referring to some vessel I already mentioned. What vessel was already mentioned? The one by the leper. That's how Rabbi Yishmael learns it from the leper, that it has to be new. Amar Rava. Rava is now going to explain the rabbis. And the rabbis say it doesn't have to be new. However, he's going to limit this. Lo shanu ela shalom nitakmu panav. He says it's only doesn't have to be new if it's not blackened. But aval nitakmu panav psulim. But if it already blackened and it looks old, no, you can't use that. My taima dumia demayim, because it has to be like the water. Because again, it says mayim kedoshim in the Kli Cheres, so it has to be similar. Ma mayim shalom nishtanu, water when it gets old, it doesn't look any different. Av kli shalom nishtana, it can't look any different. But now Rabbi asks an interesting question. By Rav, nit'akmu v'echziran letoch kivshana esh v'labnu mahu. What if it blackens and then you put it back in the kiln and you make it look like new again? So it was bad at a certain point, but now it looks great. So is that okay? Now you might say, who cares? Looks great. What's the difference? What it was in the middle. But when you learn about the temple, you learn that there's something called dachui. Because let's say you have an animal and you sanctify it for your sacrifice, and then it gets a blemish. Even if it later is fixed, it doesn't matter. It was already meant for a sacrifice and then got dachui, right, rejected. It can never go back to being used. This concept in the temple, only things that are kind of, to a certain extent, perfect. Okay? Not everything is perfection there, but there's a lot of striving for perfection. And once something gets rejected, it's like you don't want to bring anything that was rejected at some point. So therefore, they say the following. Do we say, since at some point it was blackened, it couldn't have been used then, so it can never be used? Or do we say, no, it went back to being able to be used, and sure, it looks great now. What does it matter what it was? Right? I'm thinking of those refurbished phones, or, where you buy a phone or a computer that's already, was bad. They make it new, but you always look at it a little bit differently, right? Because you know that it was refurbished, and you're always worried maybe it won't be good if I buy it. Maybe it won't last so long. So Tashma, let's learn it from here. Rabbi Elazar Omer, Eitz Erez ve'ezov u'shni talat she'ifshir ben kupato la'achora psulim. If you take all that stuff, the cedar, the hyssop, and the scarlet wool, and you put it over your shoulder in a bag, and it gets a little crushed, right? They get folded, bent, I would say. They're psulim. You can't use them again. Now, when you take it out of the bag, you can open them up, right? How many times do you stick stuff in a knapsack and it gets all crumpled? And then you take it out and you can spread it out and it kind of uncrumples. So likewise, all this stuff can uncrumple. So there you have it. It was could have been used at some point. Then it went out of use. You can't use it again because it was rejected. To which the Gemara says, no, you can't compare the two because you misunderstood that case. Try putting some branches into your bag. What's going to happen to them? It's not just that they get bent a little. That you could straighten out. That might be okay. But they're going to peel off. The bark is going to start peeling off. You're going to lose parts of it. That already is ruined, that where you can't fix that. You can't ever put it back on. That's why that's no good. But if you really could fix this kli in a kiln, then possibly it could work. In any case, we don't have an answer because we tried to learn our answer from here and we reject. Next section in the Mishna. It said, Nichnas lechalu panal yimino. The Kohen goes into the sanctuary and begins turning to the right. My time, or why to the right? They say, special halacha in the mikdash, you always have to turn to the right. And that's, I'll give you an example. When you're walking up the ramp, okay, now remember, the ramp is on the south side. So you're walking up facing north, and you want to go, let's say, to the, and the west is on your right, and the east is on your left. Let's say you want to go to the eastern, northeastern point, or southeastern point. You're going to have to first go to the southwest, to the northwest, to the northeast, and then to the southeast. You're going to have to go all the way around because you always go in the right direction. You always go toward the right. We'll see. We get to Mido. We're going to talk about that a lot more. They're going to bring a pasuk where they get it from. Makom hayasham amalama. Now we're going to talk about that piece in the ground and why they take the dirt from the adama, the earth from the ground in the Beit HaMikdash or the tabernacle. We're going to see it comes from the pasuk there. Tanu Rabbanan. Umin ha'afar asher yihiyeh. So the first way we're going to darshan this pasuk, we're only going to see the first way today. Tomorrow we'll leave the second for tomorrow. So it says you're supposed to take it from the dirt that's there. Asher yihiyeh. Now yihiyeh sounds like dirt. We're assuming we're talking about soft dirt. Okay, so that's asher yihiyeh, which is ready for use, which is soft already, right? And usually, if you have hard dirt, you have to work it, right? You have to soften it. You have to take a spade or something and kind of move it around to soften it up. So asher yihiyeh sounds like it has to be soft. So maybe takes, go outside, find earth that's hard, fix it up, and then bring it inside, all ready to go. Because asher yihiyeh, it needs to be ready to go. Talmud lomar bekarka mishkan. But then it says it has to be from the ground in the mishkan. So ibakarka mishkan yachol yachpor bakar dumot. So then what does it mean? Let's say, take the ground from the earth, from the Mishkan, from the tabernacle floor. What if it's hard? Well, you got to take a spade and go and soften it up. No. Talmud lomar asher yihiyeh. No, it has to be ready for use. So haketzad, so how do you do with it? How do you do that? Well, yesham, if there is already there, have, then bring. If you have in the Mishkan soft ground, soft earth underneath the ground, great, take that. But im ein sham, but if not, then take from soft ground from outside, bring it inside, put it in the tabernacle or in the Beit HaMikdash for a short time, and then take it from there. In other words, in the end, the Kohen has to take it from there, but it could be from stuff that was just brought from outside that you put in here that was ready to go. You don't have to start digging in the middle of the temple. Tanya Idach, there's a different braita, and that's going to darshan this pasuk a little bit differently. We'll leave that for tomorrow. So now let's just do a quick review of our daf. So we started with finishing up the braita that we saw yesterday of all the different stages of the mincha offering and a regular mincha offering. Then we went back to our Mishna, which was just comparing it to other mincha offerings. And then we said that comparison doesn't sound exactly true. And then we explained how the comparison works, even though there are ones that don't have oil or frankincense, but they do have other things that are nicer. And the Sotah is really the bottom of the bottom in every way. Then we talked about this concept, which didn't talk about it by Sotah, but it obviously applied to Sotah, as to why we don't put oil and levona on the mincha offering for a sinner. And that's because even though on the one hand, we don't want them to get away with a cheap offering, on the other hand, right, they save money. On the other hand, we don't want them to have a nice, respectful offering. And then we brought up some questions with the Nazir and the leper. Anyway, we resolved that. Then we went back to this Rabban Gamliel, who added this thing about the woman eating, how her mincha offering is a minchat behema, because her actions were animal actions. And how does that work with the source we saw before about that it was a different reason? And then we kind of said, well, that only applies to wealthy women, and this applies to poor women as well. Then we went to the next part of the process, or maybe not next, but where the Kohen takes this vessel and they fill it with water from the basin or the sink, however you could call it, in the temple. There's a debate about half a log or a quarter log. Then he goes into the heichal and he goes and picks up the earth from the ground there. We just had a whole drasha exactly how that earth works. And we had a whole drasha about how they learned it had to be, there was a machloket, is in a new earthenware vessel or an old one. And even if it's an old one, it has to be in good shape. Okay, if it's not in good shape, it's a problem. Can you fix it up? That was the debate. That's it for today. And we will catch up, pick up from here in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a great day.